Libros Schmibros is a podcast exploring the people, books, movies, and ideas that Angelinos care about in a thoughtful way that even New Yorkers can understand. We're coming to you from Libros Schmibros, our nonprofit bilingual lending library in Boyle Heights, on the west coast of the country and the east bank of the mighty Los Angeles River.
Hi, this is Cuauhtemoc Hernandez, interviewing Sandra de la Loza for the Libros Schmibros podcast. So we're going to talk about a few things about your work with the Pocho Research Society. We're going to talk about some past exhibits and also you mentioned you've been working recently on a memorial for Sleepy Lagoon. So we'll get into all of that. But before we start, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm at the tail end of two big projects. So I've been working away during the quarantine, and I'm looking forward to turning off, disconnecting, and just doing some deep reflection and envisioning and seeing where I come out from all of this.
Oh, awesome. And is it like virtual exhibits that you're planning, or?
Well, I'm working on the finalizing the memorial design on Sleepy Lagoon with my collaborator Arturo Iromo, and then I'm also finishing up a residency with the Department of Parks and Recreation County. I've been creating a framework for arts and cultural program and a toolkit for them. So that's what I've been working on the last year.
Oh, great. So yeah, you've definitely been staying active. Cool. So maybe we'll start with some of that. So we talked about maybe talking about monuments, and around your work, you focus a lot on memorials and monuments. In your book, the Pocho Research Society Field Guide to Monuments, Murals, and of Erased and Invisible Histories, it kind of documents some of the different projects you've done over the years, and you focus a lot on the idea of invisible histories, and there's a national conversation happening right now about monuments and removing certain monuments, particularly Confederate history. And out here in the West Coast, a lot of talk about Spanish missionaries and institutional racism and the monuments to those institutions. So what do you think is the power of a monument, and why is it important for you to work towards deconstructing those master narratives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, I see monuments as a public art form, if you will, that manifests historic narratives in public space. So monuments occupy public space, but they also insert a history in public space. So they create a narrative of around history. And historically, the public monument has been a monument. It's really a colonialist form and also a capitalist form. Definitely, if you look at survey monuments around the world or within the context of the US, the majority of monuments are dedicated to war heroes, and definitely war heroes who are part of the American colonialist project, or also super rich benefactors, so capitalists. So they definitely perpetuate and insert hegemonic history. So yeah, early on in the work of the Pocho Research Society, that project was born out of a desire to contest those dominant historic narratives. I grew up in Northeast LA. My family roots go here back in LA like several generations. And it wasn't until I went away to college that I saw myself reflected in history. And that was through Chicano studies classes. When I came back home, I became a history teacher. And then later I became an artist, and you know, growing up, I definitely just experienced erasure. So monuments either monumentalize violent histories, or also, like, if we look at what's erected, what stories aren't told reflect certain erasures. And as someone coming from a working class Chicano background, definitely I grew up um, not having not having narratives that spoke to my history. Realized it was really kind of, I think, a transformative event in my life was studying abroad in Mexico undergrad, and really experiencing deep history, and really learning about myself across geography, and also across history. And it was really impactful to actually see those layers of history physically present in the landscape. You know, and so when I came back to LA after school, definitely that helped me see the landscape that I called home through different eyes, and be much more aware of that erasure. So later, after becoming a history teacher and then an artist, that those actions kind of melded those two interests together. I think the Pocho Research Society, that work also is also something that is also born from what was going down in the city in the 90s and the early 2000s, with increased criminalization of brown and Black youth in the city, increased policing, increased surveillance, with what we now call the rise of the prison industrial complex. So I also saw that public space was increasingly being more controlled and more policed and more hostile. At the same time, I was, as a young cultural activist or organizer, I was exposed to a lot of different types of approaches to art, you know. So definitely, like, I think Pocho Research Society is definitely highly influenced and inspired by graph art that surfaced in the 80s and 90s, and that as a kind of a young countercultural sphere that really reclaimed public space, with and inserted its own language in public space, and through guerrilla means. So those guerrilla tactics combined with approaches to art I was introduced to as an activist. Particularly, I co-organized. I was part of a collective called Arts in Action in 2000. We organized art for actions during the Democratic National Convention, against the Democratic National Convention in 2000. And I met just tons of different people who had really provocative approaches to art. So I was introduced to Situationist, and also culture jamming of the 1990s, where people were guerrilla transforming messages of billboards in public space. So so all those kind of types of actions definitely help shape and inform and inspired Pocho Research Society.
So in terms of monuments and, you know, shaping public space, you know, because that is how a lot of us learn about our own personal space through our what's out in the public. So I kind of just want to talk a little bit more about that idea of memorializing and monuments, because we deal here in the US, we deal with it in a really fucked up way, really, as far as talking about, like preserving heritage, which is one of the reasons why politicians or the president is against tearing down certain monuments. But when you compare that to, for example, Germany, a lot of the monuments, uh, to Nazi Germany are either removed or contextualized. It seems like they have a concerted effort there um, to not to celebrate the perpetrators of violence, whereas here it seems like the excuse of preserving heritage is kind of used to maintain these memorials. Why do you think that approach is so different here in the U.S.? Like like the reluctance to address some of these figures that we memorialize.
Well, I think here in the U.S., like we're really behind in terms of reckoning with our past and reckoning with the past that is built from slavery, is built from land grabbing. That is a colonialist project. Much of the world has grappled with that and also has a long way to go. But at least in terms of intellectually in public discourse, there's an acknowledgement that colonial processes, the modern nations were created from colonialist processes and imperialist processes. And I think the US is, and I mean, if you listen to Trump's rhetoric, is still trying to hold on to a really idealized image of the United States. I think unfortunately in dominant culture in this country, I think that the dominant myths, those dominant hegemonic myths, like unfortunately, they're a good deal of the population. I think white nationalists today really want to hold on to those narratives. There's a resistance to letting go and allowing for a more complicated understanding of ourselves and of our nation and how it was built. We're just not, certain sectors of society just aren't ready for that. And that's being politically exploited at the current moment.
So you mentioned some of the work you're doing with East Yards, an environmental justice organization. You're doing a proposal, or you're already working on the actual memorial to commemorate Sleepy Lagoon. For those who aren't familiar, Sleepy Lagoon was a swimming hole along the LA River where Mexican American kids, people of color were able to swim, because in that period a lot of areas were segregated, public pools, the beaches. So this was kind of like a site for people to have access to this public space. But there was an incident that occurred in 1942, right? Where there was a murder, and the police response was to pretty much arrest everyone in sight. They arrested hundreds of teenage youth, and they were, that kind of started like a big national conversation about criminalizing brown and black youth. And this site is the history is well known, but the site itself is not really familiar to a lot of people. I'm familiar with the site because I did grow up in that area in Southeast LA, and I looked at different maps, and it kind of looked at it was maybe in Bell or Maywood, But there was no way that I really was able to find where the place was, because there was no way to track it down. So can you talk a little bit about that process for you, and why you chose to work on this site, and what's the significance of this site?
Yeah, fortunately, I was invited to work in by the organization's founder, Angelo Logan, and my collaborator Arturo Ernesto Romo and me were invited to take part of a research process. So East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice community organization based in Commerce area got funding to do the research and design component of the memorial. And so they created a research process. They created teams. So they created teams of local Tongvan cultural bearers, also some Chicano scholars and Central American scholars, to research just different aspects of the site. A landscape design firm is also hired, and we were brought in as the artists. So we went through a community engaged process of site identification, site research, and historical research. And yeah, actually the actual site where Sleepy Lagoon existed, it's not super clear. There's different theories, ideas, but it's about where near Gage and Atlantic. But the area has been radically developed, super hyper developed. So, you know, historical erasure isn't just a social process or a cultural process, but it's also an environmental and ecological process. So in our approach to designing the memorial was one to design a memorial that looks at the incident and pays homage to this youth subculture, Zoot Suiters, that got criminalized in 1942. Beginning in 1942, but also to the environmental history of the site itself. And actually, yeah, you know, it was a really special project for me because my parents well, I have a father who's living, so he's 91. They were Pachugos of that era. And actually, my father remembers Sleepy Lagoon.
Wow.
It was a mixed race space, so there was also a lot of blacks also who hung out at Sleepy Lagoon. His brother, my uncle, was actually arrested during the sweeps, and his photo was on the front page of the LA Times.
Oh wow!
And more gossipy information about that is also a couple uncles had were coupled up with the sisters of the primary defendants, the Leyvas. So so it's also very personal for me.
It goes deep. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we wanted to. I mean, I think if you look at the history of Sleepy Lagoon and you look at the incident in which a young person was found dead, was probably murdered through blunt force on the head, we don't really know the truth of what happened at that incident, how the young person died or was murdered, or there was some type of accident or something happened. There was altercations. We don't know, but what we do know is how the justice system worked at that historic moment, and how the media operated to really kind of sensationalize the event and scapegoat an entire subculture. I think a week after the incident, one scholar argues that the first mass sweep, gang sweep, if you will, happened as a result. So a week afterwards, around 100, anyone who looked like a zoot suiter was arrested, and hundreds of people, young people, were arrested. Who many did live nowhere near the area, weren't there. So
yeah, children too,
so
right?
the truth that we do have is how this incident, how this incident like exposes the racial, just racism, and how the criminalization of an entire subculture was produced through sensationalist media.
So what are some of the methods that you're using to commemorate the site?
Yeah, so there's multiple components to the design, and so we want to honor one of the themes in the memorial is a walking path, and it's on a bridge, and it will be about, it commemorates Zoot youth culture as a subculture of boundary crossing. So like actually like in 1942, like it was a war economy, and it was a segregated city still, and there's lots of boundaries that young people, through creating their own subculture, or were enacting, whether it be through like inhabiting public space, also just culturally, the intergenerational difference between their parents' generation and then young urban Latino Mexicanos, Chicanos of that era. So both the internal boundary crossing, the crossing of sexual mores and taboos of that era, and also like through dance and music subculture and dance halls, racial boundary crossing across race. So in those dance halls, those were some of the few places where that were interracial, where young people of different races mix. So we kind of want to honor that boundary crossing. We're going to have dance diagrams of feet dancing over the bridge, along with some phrases of music, big band music of the era as well. Another component will be a living memorial. So we also want to, there's an environmental component to it, and we also want to create a space for reflection and relaxation. So there will be there's a swale. So there along the swale, we're designing in a micro riparian native ecology. Wow. And there will be meditative sitting benches with what I call archival poems, words, phrases drawn from our research process, both honoring the diasporic histories, names of places of people's origins that live in the communities today, from Central America to Central Mexico to other parts of the city. And we hope that that living memorial will also be a space that can be activated with programming in the future, just to help increase like knowledge of native ecologies and also Tongan cultural practices. And then we will have a memorial wall dedicated to the incident at Sleepy Lagoon, and there will be a tiled mural. And again, like rather than depicting the events of the evening, which we don't know, you know, that those events will never be known, probably, you know, that they've been erased or they're in some people's memories. But what we do know is, but what we are highlighting is like the the way youth were depicted and their shadow sides, where they found their truth. On the shadow side of maybe the way the media distorted their image, but their truth is in that shadow. So we're inverting these ideas of light and shadow, where in Western thought, light is enlightenment. In our memorial, it's reverse. It's in the shadows that we find the truth.
Oh, thanks for sharing all of that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And is there a date when, I mean, I know everything's on hold right now, but is there is maybe in a couple years, is it plan on?
Well, hopefully, lots of things are in flux. So the project was funded for the design phase, and then the second phase would be to get funding to get it built. So hopefully that happens. Yeah, we're in this moment of where everything's shifting. So we'll see where we
Well, definitely, I'll definitely try to stay updated on that. So I want to shift a little bit. So in your book, you in the book Field Guide to LA, Monuments and Murals of Erased and Invisible Histories, you also have a section about Echo Park, where you and it kind of triggered me when or it reminded me when you were talking about the subcultures and the dance halls and stuff like that. There's something, I guess, a thread that goes through your work also about these spaces that people create, and you talk about remembering Latina lesbian bars and queer bars in Echo Park, and it's really interesting because you actually you put plaques to commemorate certain sites, and some of those sites are really well-known venues now that people probably know, like, for example, the Echo, and it's interesting to see that you talk about these histories, because it's they really have been erased by the like the hipster gentrifier type in Echo Park, and it's and it's really a tragic thing, because these spaces that you write about were places that people created because they didn't really have a lot of other spaces. Like, these are intimate spaces where they could really be their full selves, and you think about what took its place, the Echo, and like they kind of are the person who runs the Echo, he owns a bunch of other venues, and he definitely is pushing for this other history of Echo Park, or this new history of Echo Park. So why is it important for you, or what's the motivation to commemorate these sites in Echo Park, for example? And can you talk a little bit about that? The issue, how you also address issues of displacement and erasure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how intentional it was, but I think there is a thread connecting a lot of my work, and that is one, like, paying homage to spaces that aren't likely to be recorded or remembered, but are important and vital in terms of creating space for communities that aren't non-hegemonic communities that are marginalized socially in some way, and unfortunately those histories also tend to be woven with histories of displacement as well. So yeah, that project came out when I was living in Echo Park, Silver Lake at that time. I came of age in the 90s and frequented a lot of those spaces, and also downtown LA, where there was like a thriving, very underground countercultural sphere, and I just saw it becoming displaced and also co-opted, and it's rebellion, it's spunk, it's fun. The liberatory impulses just getting softened and commodified and morphing into something else, to a point then all of a sudden I would find myself in like foreign areas that I'd spent a lot of time in, just feeling like I'm in foreign territory, so I went to Berkeley undergrad, spent some time in the Bay Area, and so I saw gentrification happen in the Mission District like 10 years before it really happened in LA. So I had seen the signs, and I also saw like first wave it happening with bars, and most of the bars were queer spaces. So that was kind of so that was unfolding. So the work really, even though it's about history, it's also a way of addressing what I see unfolding in the present. And so when those plaques went up, I was addressing the gentrification I was seeing happening in Echo Park at that time.
And that kind of references the famous quote in your book, history is a battleground of the present. Can you talk a little bit about that phrase, and is that something that you came up with? What was the significance of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that this phrase has been used probably before. I'm not the first to utter that phrase, but that's something I came up with, and just understanding that like history is a construction and history is an act of power, and history is a way of creating narratives that shape our perception of ourselves and of the world we live in, and history is used to legitimize and sanctify established orders. And so yeah, and so in liberation struggles, are always like fueled by contending with our histories. Our present is just an accumulation of a huge living tumultuous past that we are standing on. That also is constantly is not necessarily that hegemonic, I think, dominant power tries to control. But also history is defiant itself. History also, things from the past also resurface and kind of disrupt those dominant narratives. One of the first plaque I put up actually was dedicated to the mural Tropical America by David Alfaro Siqueiros. Now it's a center in Olvera Street, but it was a mural erased in the early 1930s, 6 months after Siqueiros painted it, and it had been whitewashed for decades. But there's photos in the 70s, and I think Schiffer Goldman and first generation Chicano artists and art historians, scholars of that era, documented it. It refused to be erased, and literally under like decades and decades of whitewashing, that mural would resurface. So yeah, history is an act of power, but it is also something very alive and uncontrollable, and I find inspiration in that.
Yeah, and you also encourage people to become what you term a guerrilla historian, right? Why do you encourage people to practice that, or how would one practice being a guerrilla historian?
Yeah, and I think as I said, like history is a construction in many ways. Like history is fictionalized. We create narratives. And there's truths embedded in those histories, and also history can be a space where we can we can learn, we can fuel ourselves and learn and analyze and it can inform our actions. But yeah, I more so than an interest in creating the correct version of history, I'm much more interested in horizontalizing the act of history making, and also in making, I'm much more interested in history being a space of popular discourse, where in which people are active in history making. So yeah, toppling monuments is one strategy of contesting memorials, but another would be like the idea of the palimpsest is to overload those monuments with counter histories that transform those histories. So make it a public discourse, you know. So yeah, I definitely think that being active, hopefully by being active, people take an interest in history, dialoguing, arguing, hopefully listening, learning, growing, transform, that we can learn, grow, and transform from that process, you know. So yeah, so those are kind of some other reasons why I do that work.
Wow, great answer. Well, thank you so much for sharing. So we're almost wrapping up. I think I haven't gotten the Zoom warning yet, but before we end the interview, I wanted to ask you. So this is I kind of want to do like a recurring question to my guest, and this is right up your alley. So I ask people to choose an intersection that maybe has particular significance to them, or maybe history of the city of LA that is not really exposed. And most of your work deals with site specific, and you have a lot of dialogue with urbanism and a lot of that stuff in your work. But is there something that maybe has particular, like a specific intersection or street maybe that you would commemorate also, maybe?
Yeah, I'd say the intersection of the 5 freeway and the 110 freeway. And so the freeways, it's by and it's actually at that intersection is like Glasso Park and Lincoln Park.
Close to the confluence, right, of the LA River and
right above the confluence.
Yes.
So that's also why I chose that intersection. So not only is it the intersection of 2 freeways, and the 110 being the first freeway in the city, and thinking about how the freeways have transformed the city and shaped the geography of the city, and also fueled like its impact on race and class divisions in spatial, how race and class is spatialized through the building of the freeways. But also underneath that intersection, those 2 freeways also follow rivers. And so when we talk about colonization, definitely we need to think about the colonization of the land. And also if we think about the colonization of this land, not only of the people, all the native groups who lived here, but also the life force were those rivers, and which have been channelized, but which are still alive. And actually, if you walk down into the intersection of the rivers at the confluence, it's really kind of beautiful. You hear the roar of the cars, the traffic above. It almost sounds like an ocean roar. Almost, it does sound like a river of automobiles. but there's a whole space and time move differently there, and it becomes quiet, and there's birds, and you could hear the gurgle of the river. So it's a really beautiful, magical place. And through this work, it's helped me get under the layers and layers and layers of history and reconnect with the land, which is alive and pulsing, and those ecologies are still present, even if they've been so obliterated and paved. So that's my magic.
Wow, that's such a wonderful answer. Very poetic. I appreciate that. Great. And so there's so much more that I would want to talk to you about. You've written, really great essays about muralism. You've even approached Chicano muralism in a really refreshing perspective. So I would love to have another conversation with you on that. You also recently had an exhibit at LACE, To Oblivion, the Speculator's Eden at Los Angeles, at the Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. So unfortunately, we couldn't cover all of that. I mean, your work is really broad, and I'm really happy that I got a chance to talk with you. But hopefully, hopefully we can stay in touch, and I'd love to stay updated on the Sleepy Lagoon project, as well as the other work you're doing around displacement and development. I know you write a lot about that, and really looking forward to all the updates that you bring forward.
Thank you so much. Bye, LA. I love you. You on the streets.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
So ends another episode of Libros Schmibros, recorded at the bilingual nonprofit Libros Schmibros Lending Library in Boyle Heights. By all means, follow us online in all the old familiar places, or email us via info@libroschmibros.org. By the way, we couldn't do this podcast without the whole Libros team: Cuauhtemoc, Colleen, Diana, and Alberto. And all of them would kill me if I didn't add this. Please consider visiting libroschmibros.org, hitting the donut button, the donate button, and giving us a gift. We put good free books into people's hands 5 days a week here at Libros, right across from Mariachi Plaza, up in the old Boyle Hotel. I'm David Kippen, and there'll always be a free book for you, and thousands more to borrow here at Libros Schmibros.